Is this a familiar, frustrating sight? Does this remind you of your daily drive to work? Well, just hang on. Change is in the air. In the not-too-distant future, the skies could be filled with flying cars. And getting to work in the morning will be a breeze. That is, if you listen to this man, Paul Mahler, who 40 years ago became obsessed with making a car that flies. 4 decades on, he's still consumed with the idea and is determined to show the world that he's been right all along. But the big question now for 66-year-old Mahler is, will he be around long enough to see his vision flourish? Hence, this impressive daily dose of every health-enhancing pill imaginable. Ever since he was a kid on a chicken farm in an isolated valley in British Columbia, Paul Mahler has been inventing things. He was blessed with a great pair of practical hands and an ingenious mind to match. At 11 years old, he made a fully operational hand-powered Ferris wheel, and at 14, he decided his dad's '34 Ford was in dire need of a makeover.
You know, I stripped it down to the bare frame and built a complete body. From that, it had doors that open automatically sideways. It had fenders that turned with the front wheels. It had a lot of interesting, innovative things in it at that time. When it came to mechanical things, physically putting parts together and figuring out how they work and imagining how to create something, that was relatively easy for me.
And all through trade school and university, the young engineer who wowed people with his mechanical skills vowed to the skeptics that he was on the verge of a breakthrough that would revolutionize the way we travel. And even as early as 1967, Mahler had designed and built his XM2, a flying saucer look-alike.
They often say, were you inspired by the Jetsons? I don't know who inspired them. If I inspired the Jetsons, then it inspired me, but I was flying this around, or at least had models of it in the newspapers in the 60s.
Of course, those closest to young Mr. Mahler were caught up in his obsession, too.
I am his first wife, and I met him about 40 years ago. He was an assistant professor of engineering at UC Davis at the time, and I was in graduate school.
So we're probably around ranges, which is really what we're operating at.
He'd come home and just go into the garage and start working. It was amazing. He built this thing entirely without any blueprints at all. He came up with a design in his head and then pieced it together entirely in his head. I've never seen anybody do anything that complex out of their head. So that to me was evidence that he really was a mechanical genius. We did have some time off, you know. He used to ride his unicycle around the neighborhood for recreation.
But his unicycling skill was a mere sideshow. The XM2 was Mahler's main attraction. But on its maiden flight in 1967, the machine more resembled a punch-drunk prize fighter than a serious contender as a form of transport.
I read about his flying car. I went up to Davis and see him, and I was there during the first flight, and everybody laughed at him. I thought it was comical, and I congratulated him. We got to know each other, and later I told him I would help him raise money and invest in his company, which I did.
Urged by Mahaka to leave his teaching post and work full-time on his invention, Mahler was none too keen on giving up his day job.
You got to take the chance. I said, the trouble with you, my friend, is you don't have any guts. I said, I got enough guts for both of us. So finally, after 6 months, he called me. He said, well, I'm resigning. I said, great, that's the best thing you ever done.
Since the 1920s, inventors have attempted to develop a practical flying car. All have had at least one serious flaw: the need for a traditional runway. But Mahler knows that to be practical, a flying car must go straight up and straight down. VTOL, vertical takeoff and landing.
Well, it's really an infrastructure issue. You know, if you've got to have a runway, you really limit the capacity of the usefulness of the vehicle. If you've got to go to an airport, and of course airports are limited because they take a lot of space, you don't have airports everywhere.
Mahler's inspiration came from a very peculiar source. As a boy, Paul had been captivated by the grace and agility of these tiny creatures.
Well, the hummingbird is really the ultimate mobility, the ability to take off vertically, to fly backwards, to fly forwards, to accelerate very rapidly, to fly fast. But a hummingbird has a very high metabolism rate for a good reason. It takes a lot of energy to hover. So we really had the same kind of problem that hummingbird has in the mechanical world. We had to find some way of generating a very large amount of power in a very small, lightweight package.
This vertical takeoff and landing flying cylinder was his prototype. Called the Aerobot, it was designed for the military so they could peer behind enemy lines. This theory was good, and Paul went into full-time production of the new improved Skycar. Hot off the bench came the M200X, a design he believed really would fly. The difference between the M200X and earlier models was the power plant. Now he had stronger rotary engines that could deliver the lift needed to get him straight up and in flying mode.
I estimate it would take us about 10 years, but Paul is very methodical. And that's probably the only fault he has, besides being a genius.
This is Dr. Paul Mahler flying the M200X.
And finally, 20 years and millions of dollars later, Mahler was ready to unveil his M200X Skycar to a patient world.
When I flew for the press in 1989, I actually was very afraid because I knew that I had a tether, but the tether really wasn't very meaningful, and certainly if anything failed, it could be, and probably would have been fatal. So I was the most happy person that's ever existed in my life is when I'd completed that 2-minute flight and was returning for the landing and knew that I was going to continue to live for a while longer.
The engines create a downward thrust, pushing Mahler's flying machine slightly upwards. But going forward is a tougher proposition.
It's a neat vehicle for many applications, but what it lacks forward speed capability, and if you try to fly this forward, you don't have a big tail setting out here to stabilize it. And that's risky because if something goes wrong there at high speed, you don't have a second chance. It just blows the thing right up.
Thankfully, Mahler saw fit to return to the drawing board. In 1996, 30 years after unveiling his original flying machine, Mahler rolls out his sleek new M400 Skycar. It's designed to cruise comfortably at 350 miles an hour, get up to 28 miles to the gallon, and go 900 miles on a tank of gas.
I always see things I don't want to see. The aircraft, as you can see, has the nacelles on an angle right now. This is the takeoff mode, and as the aircraft lifts off the ground and starts forward very quickly, the nacelles themselves rotate down into the horizontal position, which is very efficient for forward flight.
The pivoting motors were designed to correct the problems of previous models that had always been difficult to control in forward flight. Now, Paul thinks that's all behind.